I need you to trust me. I need you to be trustworthy. In the thick dimness of the room, she watched the black-garbed girl in front of her struggle around a thing that had settled over them like a net. A thing that had fused between them like a badly broken limb, shattered numerous times, healing, gnarled, and awful. Gideon recognized these strictures all of a sudden. The rope tying her to Harrow and back to the bars of the House of the Ninth.
You're listening to Nun Pod with Left Grief, episode 19. Put it in the hole, Griddle. We are very excited to welcome Kit. Hello, Kit.
Hi! I'm so very glad to be here. Hello, everyone.
So we know you through the Locked Tomb cosplay community, but tell us a little bit about how you got into Gideon the Ninth and what your relationship with this text is.
Where to start? So I found out about Gideon the Ninth way back in 2019 on a college visit to Fort Collins, Colorado, where I found this book. My mother found this book, actually. And I picked it up like this, thought that Gideon was a dude, and put it back down. As I was on a college visit, my mother picked this back up and was reading it, and she's like, I don't know how I feel about this. And I was like, yeah, I picked it up earlier, and I opened it like this and saw unveils a solar system of swordplay, cutthroat politics, and lesbian necromancers, and I was like, I'm gonna get this book, actually. So this is that very copy that I got in the bookshop. Shout out Firehouse Books in Fort Collins. And it took me a couple months to actually read it, as I was in high school at the time. But I finished this book the day that they announced the start of quarantine lockdown in the United States. So I grew to essentially make this book a part of my personality over the course of quarantine. And the rest is history. Harrow was my first cosplay I ever did.
Same.
I think it really revolutionized a lot of things about understanding who I was as a person. I was 17 when reading it, and I was just so impressionable that honestly, thank God that it's this book that I read and not something else. But yeah, I mean, there is very little about me that is not tied on a fundamental level to the Locked Tomb series, which is really crazy to think about.
I am delighted that your age and life aligned with this book in the way that it did. As you were describing that, I was recognizing the book that I picked up that aligned with my age in a similar way, and I was like, man, such better literature. But in the same way, it's a tough journey to kind of parallel yourself with, because it's someone going through an extraordinarily dehumanizing time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So integrating your understanding of yourself as a creative person and a literary person with someone who is going through an incredibly hard time, but also as an independent human being, that's not a light process.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that my age-matched sword girl was Alana from the Song of the Lioness, which is a pretty friggin' upbeat. That's a really different story.
There's something about having someone that you can explore yourself with.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at your work as a cosplayer, you have cosplayed so many different characters in this, and talking to Caro, our previous guest of ours as well, there is something really marvelous about having a media where you can explore parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not just limited to yes, you and Harrow had that age parallel, but there's all these other characters that you chose to explore, and it kind of expand your relationship with the book and with yourself through.
Absolutely. Especially being involved in Discord servers back in 2020 during quarantine. I remember the feeling of being trapped in my room and being 17 and being I am Harrow, not Harrow, Harkness, guess of it. I was so into it. It's been very interesting, kind of growing up alongside the main characters in the series and seeing how, yes, Ianthe is right in Harrow the Ninth when she says 23 is a world away from 18.
Yeah.
Or whatever. I'm 23 now, so yeah.
Yeah, there is something really beautiful about authors who use expansive casts of characters, and authors who explore those characters over a large period of time. Like when you're describing that, I'm thinking of one of my favorite authors is Gavriel. He does like fantasy and like his historically inspired fantasy stuff, but it's seeing the same story through many different eyes. That is such a rich experience. And even like Muir does this in subtle ways, even with the choice of like which house skull to feature at the beginning of each chapter. It's not like we're using, this other person's first person perspective. There's actually multiple lenses being offered simultaneously. Even if it's through one person's eyes, you're like, okay, but we're putting more weight on these individuals while they're being seen through the same individual's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
You feel the different priorities experienced by these people who have come together in this moment.
We've got a second house skull for the first time, I believe. And Gideon and Harrow are unlocking their very first Lyctor lab. So we get this sense of foreboding that Gideon is really noticing that like Canaan House does not feel friendly and beautiful anymore. Canaan House feels empty and hollow and dead and foreboding.
Canaan House feels cruel, but through the eyes of this young person, the kind of cruelty doesn't really have a language yet. There is a little bit of illusion of like, we are the children of the houses. So there's kind of this indication of the stakes. We've talked about succession crises before on the podcast. But one thing I love about Muir's writing is the language possessed by the narrator is the language that she uses. And I think, following some of the events that have happened recently, like cruelty is a part of that.
I think we see a lot in this chapter as well, that having witnessed the deaths of the fifth, Gideon is having some pretty significant activation about prior deaths that she's experienced and that she has witnessed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ninth house being what it is, like the shell of what used to be, even though it never was supposed to be anything. The only parental figures that like she was even witness to, like being the only comparison that she has to this couple that she barely knew, is really like, it's very fascinating.
And it contrasts Gideon's experience of that versus what Gideon is perceiving Harrow's experience of that to be, because it talks really quite quickly of the perception that Gideon has that Harrow is unaffected by these same things in the beginning of the chapter, but that shifts as this chapter goes on.
It does, but at the same time, there's indications that Harrow experiences delight. We talked in a previous episode about like, have we ever heard a description of Harrow experiencing a positive emotion? And here, like, yes, solidly yes. Harrow likes research.
Mm-hmm.
Harrow likes a puzzle. Harrow likes to collect clues. There's a kind of like Harriet the Spy, Matilda-esque, like problem-solving, curious person there that like even in the depths of feeling lost because suddenly the rules of the game seem to have changed or have been actually revealed, this driving force of Harrow to research, to learn, to explore, to develop, like, is such a core part of who she is, that she develops such a, like, that she expresses such a satisfaction whenever that part of her can be front and center.
Harrow both affirms Gideon's agency over the key and the key ring, and also, like, does a pun. She she says the key ring is yours. I have to admit it, so you must admit us. She's doing wordplay.
That might even be like an example of you know, Harrow for a number of chapters now has been opening up to Gideon, and often when you find that you open up to someone, you start to take on some of their mannerisms. This may be an example of her taking on a little bit of Gideonisms.
Gideon likes puns.
I think that this whole pun and the obvious sex joke that she makes of put it in the hole, I mean, I think that, like, it's kind of alluded to in at least Harrow the Ninth, that Harrow, I mean, of course she understands exactly, like, where these puns come about. Like, she's not completely oblivious to sex jokes. I think that it's a very lovely little glimpse of like the filter being raised in Harrow of something she would never normally say to play into. She knows exactly what's going to come afterward if she says put it in the hole, Griddle, but she's allowing it to happen this one time for just the pure excitement of I might get to flex the thing that I came here to do.
And there's something about like a setup for someone who makes puns that is a loving gift where you're like, I know I'm about to suffer from what I'm about to say, but I'm still going to say it because I know that you're going to have fun.
It's a really sort of vulnerable intimacy. It's a really small vulnerability, but it still is.
And, you know, with Harrow giving those things so rarely, you know, it doesn't have to be big for it to be fairly profound and kind of striking.
And when Gideon says that's what she said, Harrow doesn't punish her or get mad at her or yell at her or scold her. Like, they're playing together.
Mm-hmm. Like, that's part of my love for this chapter, besides everything that is inside of the actual lab. Of this is like a really great first glimpse that we see, especially before the fallout that occurs in later chapters, of the fact that they could actually be friends in both of their minds. I had highlighted back in 2020 when I was first like annotating these about Gideon's nightmares about being on the wrong side of the door of the locked tomb.
Yes.
Which is, I think any child who would be raised on the Ninth would absolutely be like completely terrified of it. But the idea of Canaan House being similar to Gideon, of like starting to feel like trapped in the walls closing in due to the tragedy of Abigail and Magnus, is fascinating, alongside the narrative implications of the foreshadowing of this is incredible, I think, of Canaan House, the place in which so much happened, and how we find out in Nona everything happened at Canaan House being put up against the tomb in the Ninth House.
Yeah, like, it's incredible that she draws that parallel because it's so correct.
Oh, well, also the very literal parallel that it references into this with there being a vault and there being dead parents behind the vault. Because as they left the Ninth, Harrow was like, Mom and Dad are going to go have some vows of silence behind the gate. Like,
that's true. I was thinking in the other direction that there's horrific, unthinkable sin behind the vault.
Mm-hmm.
So both the like people who may have been responsible for safety or comfort are now dead and behind locked doors, behind which also are unthinkable sin and corruption and harm. And now no one can protect you. Like, these things almost form an ongoing pattern, but the very literal parallel of there being like a thing that the God Emperor has created a gate to protect from getting out, and now the people who are responsible for your safety are dead and behind it.
I mean, even before Magnus and Abigail died, there are full wings of Canaan House that are completely off limits to people because of either erosion or whatever happened there, which we are not privy to, obviously, in any of the books so far. I do think there's also this idea of Alecto in the tomb is meant to be like this, in our folklore, our knowledge of like the earth and like the earth personified is usually seen as a mother, and a woman as like a protector or a maternal figure. So I think that like also kind of plays into the really fun foreshadowing. And the line that follows of especially after what Harrow had done, because then it scares her more after Harrow has seen it. Why does what's behind the door of the locked tomb scare Gideon more after Harrow saw it?
And this also attribution of their suicide to Harrow's responsibility. There is something about the pivoting of responsibility and accountability onto the children that keeps repeating happening here. Like, Gideon has seen it in this way. She blames Harrow for what's happened to her parents, but there's like a much larger power structure that both of them have never had a choice to how they've kind of come into it.
I think that's not what she means here, because in the pool scene, Gideon says that she killed Harrow's parents, and Harrow is like, "What? That's crazy. No, of course you didn't." So when Gideon says what Harrow did, I don't think it's killing her parents because she thinks that she's responsible for that. And so the thing Harrow did was open the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think she gets more scared of the tomb when she finds out that it can get unlocked.
Mm-hmm.
Given the fact that, as we just mentioned, it is a thing designed to keep unspeakable horrors in and protecting the people outside from the unspeakable horrors, that does track for sure.
This also kind of like within the logic of that asks the question of like, am I the unspeakable horror? Am I the thing that gets locked in the dark? Which like that's the kind of question that an abused kid asks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that line has always really stood out to me. I think is something that only gets more interesting as the books continue on and as we gain more context to anything that happened at Canaan House. I'm so curious about what happened at Canaan House. There is a carving on this key that I have always wondered what it actually is meant to look like because no one's ever mentioned it before. It says at the butt end where the teeth terminated, a tiny carving had been made in the metal. It was a collection of dots joined together with a line and 2 half circles.
So our conversations about this so far, I think we've touched on this maybe 2 or 3 times. We've re-explored this because this is also above the door. In the initial description, it also talks about an animal skull with horns that curve inward, almost touching. We have 3 different pieces. We have the dots and lines above the door. We have the animal skull, and then we have this inscription on the key. This language doesn't emphasize that curvature, that horn-like curling quite in the same way. When I was listening to this earlier today, my mind, softened those curves. They were partial arcs rather than spirals. And I think the fact that the language is ambiguous with each reiteration of what I think is fairly concludable to be the same image. Saying that the animal skull is related to these 2, like the image above the door and the image on the key, those being the same makes sense. The fact that the animal skull might be directly related is a bit more speculative.
The half circles are confusing. I've heard that maybe it's, Aries or something, like it's a constellation diagram.
Yes.
But as far as I know, those aren't usually illustrated with half circles, so I don't know what the half circles are doing.
So
I feel like it's the kind of thing where once we know what it is, we'll be like, oh, fuck, okay, yeah, But I don't know what it is.
I don't know about the collection of dots, but I do know astrological symbols, and the only one that includes curvatures, 2 curvatures, that could be counted as half circles is the Pisces symbol.
Oh, I was thinking of diagrams of the constellations themselves as dots with lines.
Which absolutely makes sense. All I mean though is constellations don't really have proper half circles because it's just not really found.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's very fascinating. I have a lot of theories surrounding necromancy, I guess, that I've noodled on as someone who got a theater degree. As interested as a person with a theater degree can be interested in nuclear chemistry, I know nothing. But I am very convinced that necromancy is related to nuclear physics and nuclear chemistry. So I've often wondered if it was something having to do with that, or if there's any sort of
There is a language, like a nomenclature, like a descriptive standard for describing symbols. And I have to go dig up my book about it because the ways in which symbols are often encoded and redescribed, like how math and poetry can describe the same things in 6 different ways. Once you have something that's a bit more codified and you can use consistently repeatedly, it can illustrate it a bit more precisely. And so I want to go into this book that I have that's like a dictionary of symbols and see where this image would fit in its pictures, because often you also get an implication of the family of other imagery and ideology that imagery comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So then that would give you what schools of thought has this drawn on that is clearly related to the larger body of, necromancy, but also philosophy and ideology that this is rooted in.
Yeah, and she wouldn't have mentioned it if it wasn't really specific, and she didn't have a
Mhm.
specific thing in mind because so everything of what she does is so intentional.
Yeah.
So
But it also including the lack of context that our narrator has.
Yeah. And Gideon describes this as Moonspeak, which is a weird that like that's weird. Feels like that's a clue, but I don't know what to make of it.
X203. Oh, that's meant to be like door 203 too in Harrow's own map. Yeah, it's been so
Oh,
long
this is
since I've read
her
Gideon the
own
Ninth.
language.
I
Okay.
think
So
I think
Gideon's
it's
just making fun
just
of her.
oh yeah, she whipped out her stained journal and brooded over her maps. So
Hmm.
X203 is meant to correspond to what she has in her personally written maps and is not written anywhere on the actual door. And so Moonspeak, yeah, it's definitely just getting joshing Harrow. I'm glad to know that no one's really figured out exactly what that symbol is because I would be dying to know, but also I feel like it's something having to do with maybe something that will be revealed in Electo if we ever get it.
This lab is fascinating because it's got the like laboratory workspace, it's got a training area, and then it's got the sleeping
Hmm.
area. But all of this is so weird.
Thank God Tamsin gives us so much to work with in terms of just like little things listed off of like there is a this in here, there is a this in here. It's so much foreshadowing to the characters that we later either meet or hear about. In particular, the unaltered state of the room that's
Mhm.
described right off the bat, like nothing had ever aged, is so interesting to me, given that Ianthe in Harrow is studying the way to preserve life.
Mhm.
Like the fact that the preserved blood is still red in this
Mhm.
room is freaky.
Yeah,
And
everything is like it just got froze. It's like they just walked out of it.
I think like the use of the word froze compared to the specific word crystallized, which is the very first way that this is described, is interesting because like freezing and crystallization are both like structurally distinct ways of making something that is mobile and varying into a static shape. But it is not without its way of altering the nature of that material. Like
mm-hmm.
fossilization, crystallization, freezing are all taking something that has a much more flexible structure and fixing that structure as it is. And so if we're just focusing on the blood itself, as blood dries, the ways that oxygen is preserved within it changes structurally, and those bright red tones start to turn into those browner tones, and we see oranges happen with oxidation. To think about like, the nuke, like you were talking about nuclear physics, to look at like the structural impact of whatever preservation technique was used here, assuming that it was some sort of, if we're talking about blood, thalergetic work, it to me like speaks of not turning something liquid into a crystalline structure, but just taking the movement out,
Mm.
like
Mm-hmm.
taking the molecular movement and just stopping it. I think about thanergy and thalergy in terms of like science knowledge we already have, which may be sending myself off in the wrong direction. But the word crystallize is really interesting here to me because fossilization, freezing is literally a crystallization. It's taking something that is a soft tissue, adding a mineral structure to it.
I think a lot of things that have to do with thalergy they're so specific in this series because we never really get to see the second house using their specialty of
Mhm.
like siphoning thalergy in particular, not thanergy, from non-house soldiers and using it as fodder for their own soldiers and all that because we really only see thalergy. Oh, this is maybe a theory that I have that I don't even know if this is canon. That's how long I've had this series
All
in
right,
my
let's do
mind for
it.
is I don't even know what's canon or not. I think that John's way of doing necromancy is all thalergetic. I don't think it is thanergetic in nature.
Mm.
And
Interesting.
that's
So
why
that
his necromancy feels so off to everyone around him. I mean, it's also powered by the sun, but, tomato, tomato. I think the only other time that we see necromancy being used to completely stop something in time are both done by John. And they're done like he says at the dinner table scene with the soup, he says, just stop. And
Mhm.
everything completely stops midair, which is basically the process that's being done with this with these tanks of blood here because it is the stopping of oxygen where it is in this blood to never escape or move. Because even if you seal off blood in like an airtight thing, it's a liquid.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's going to like not be the same after 10,000 years.
That would imply that it was John that froze this room, not the people that worked here.
I mean, I think it is a theorem that would be available to lictors, but it's kind of like the regenerative ash thing of it's only really feasible for a lictor or someone with lictor level access to Thanergy to try and like attempt, because it like regenerative ash is like, you know, it turns bone into like clay that never goes anywhere, and like it's not something that they have to conscientiously like keep up. I think it would make sense though to say that John potentially did this to most of Canaan House, and it's something that is so easy and so tiny on the grand scale of things to keep up a couple of jars of blood or whatever. I mean, it could be, you know, Gideon the First freezing everything, and you know that's just something that he did, but we never get to see any of the other labs really in the state that we were intended to see them in, outside of, you know, the whole finale big fight. And again, we weren't intended to see it in the state that that Gideon and Harrow really found it in with Ianthe and like the third house and you lied to us and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It you know, to me says that at some point there's an activation here. Because like once they're in the room, do you think that is still ongoing? Like, do you think that blood is still inert? It's still frozen now that they have opened that door and are in that space and are affecting the things in the space?
It feels like no on kind of an instinctive level, but also like the John trick is unnatural. So I would buy it either way, but my gut says maybe no.
My gut says no, largely on the fact that like keeping Gideon and Harrow unaffected by that while they are interacting with this space involves another layer of explanation.
Yeah, because we know that critical entropy can happen to bodies in the space.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really, I really, really wish that like Thompson had given us another lab to compare, but I know that would have given us far too much information for the first book of this series. Honestly, like I think that the whole point is that we do not have a comparison to make.
It feels
unfortunately.
like there's so many weird things about this space given its proximity to the rest of Canaan House.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why does Pyrrha need her own training space when the gym is right there? And why do they have this tiny ass bedroom when they're in this huge building? Like, what's happening here?
I mean, it's so militaristic. It's militaristic in nature. And I mean, with what we learn about Gideon the First and Pyrrha in the following novel, like how close they were, I think it's like, yeah, Augustine and Alfred, they want separate rooms. They're like, I'm not sleeping in the same room as my brother. Like I could see other characters having way different setups or way more grandiose setups, but it makes sense for these two characters, I feel. And I honestly, like, ever since figuring out who Gideon and Pyrrha is, I've just been like, Drax.
Speaking of surprises in this space, the jeweled tools were a surprise given the sort of Spartan personalities of both these. Neither of these are really like ornate, flashy folks. And of course, we've got this group photograph where everybody's faces are scribbled out, which I have to assume is Cytherea's doing.
Okay, if it's Cytherea's doing, then she was able to maintain the crystallization during her alteration of this room. Because given the timeline, that red blood would have started to coagulate and change in color, even in just a number of hours.
Not in a flask. In a flask that could have been unfrozen maybe a couple of days ago.
I don't think that it was done by Cytherea.
Oh.
I've honestly never really thought about it as being Cytherea, as in The only way to access this room would have been if she had gone through before anyone else and had gotten all of the keys, which would mean that there would be no keys left for anyone else to get later
'cause she
on.
wouldn't have saved
There are
the
no
ship.
copies.
Yeah.
So I don't think that, like,
So do you
unless
think-
the key had been stolen from one of them at some point to get in here, this had to have been done by Gideon following the lictorization process that killed most of the people, I think.
Oof.
I think, like, a thing of, like, we're so sorry. Like, this is like the Kithaerea saying, we take so much. Everything is, like, this is their, like, Gideon's way of grieving what has happened here, I think. Of no one should be able to ever see the faces of the people that have committed these atrocities. And no one should ever be repeating these theorems, which is why things are scribbled out and all over Canaan House. Things are erased and scribbled and left half finished.
When I imagine these moments of the first generation of lictors, like, reckoning with their own emotional reactions of the consequences and realities of their actions, like, I think of, the timing of their research and them seeing the impact of the cumulative effect over time of them continuing to push this, and using the timeline you described, which is like post mortem. Don't know if that's the right phrasing, but, like, you know what I mean? And, like, I slow down my understanding, because this is, 10,000, 9,000, many, many years ago. But in this moment, this is a very passionate response. This is a sentimental action that has nothing to do with their research, but instead has to do with them reclaiming a little bit of humanity by acknowledging that these were people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a kind of, like, dilation and then intense focus on timing that comes with some of these elements being highlighted.
I think that this room is a remnant of Gideon the First's grief. And I take back my earlier statement of John doing this whole preservation thing to this room and it being I think my standing theory with this, and no one has to agree with this, it's just me expressing thoughts, I think, of just Gideon and Pyrrha, obviously in this room, were living as one person. Their entire challenge that they present to the lictoral trials is being able to act as one person with two souls or two minds controlling one body. This is massive foreshadowing to what Gideon and Pyrrha have to do later on in the series anyhow. I think that Gideon is so lost after losing Pyrrha to the lictoral process that he has to preserve everything about Pyrrha's existence in this room, but he cannot bear himself to look at the faces of the people that were lost to this.
Whose gun?
That was my next question. Guns.
Whose gun?
Pyrrha.
I mean,
Oh
Pyrrha was
my
a cop.
god.
Although
Okay.
not an American cop. Do they get do their cops have guns?
I don't think so, but I do think that Pyrrha knows how to use a gun.
Yeah.
They
were also, like, Pyrrha and Gideon grew up, like, rural, right?
Mm-hmm.
So knowing that, like, there isn't a need for a gun here, this would have been kept for sentimental reasons, perhaps.
I would offer a counter that Gideon and Cam have their cav weapon and their real weapon.
Mm-hmm.
What if Pyrrha's real weapon is a Glock?
I would believe that in a second. I would. I immediately think of Togusa from Ghost in the Shell. Who,
oh my god.
Amongst the Ghost in the Shell
So
cast, he is this, like, very distinctly different character, and his relationship with his gun is part of how we understand who he is. He likes this very analog, physical, uncomplicated tool that he can make sense of compared to all the complexity and cybernetic enhancement of the rest of his peers.
So I don't know how much you guys know about guns.
Medium.
I'm a Canadian. Probably a lot less.
Okay, so just something that is always, I think, useful to point out, because blowback carbine gun is a really specific name for a gun that is actually pretty well known as another name. my Texas license. That is a Tommy gun. It is like
Mm.
a mafioso submachine gun that is automatic.
You know what's wild? That is the only gun that I have ever shot, is a Tommy gun.
There you go.
It was at a friend's birthday, and like I actually kind of enjoyed it. I thought it was a really interesting experience. And as far as like a tactile feedback instrument, that is a very specifically designed tool for because I think of these tools as like, okay, there's an objective. There's a really specific application of force being desired to be here. And that is a high repetition, wide spray, cheap. To me, the thing that speaks out is that Tommy guns to me have a real historical association. They don't seem like a modern weapon. And in this room, we also have electric toothbrushes. We have some really like chronologically contextualizing objects in this room. And like the Tommy gun versus the electric toothbrushes thing seems like a real big contrast for me as someone whose life is going to exist within 1 century. If it's serving its Pyrrha's gun, there's a bit of nostalgia that might also be tied in with this choice.
Yeah, absolutely. The Tommy gun, the Thompson submachine gun is sort of most famously associated with like the gangsters of the 20s and 30s, but it was invented during World War I in response to the conditions of trench warfare, stalemate, and it was also used by the Allies in World War II. So like this is a very kind of like early to mid 20th century weapon. And like you can still get one, but yeah, it was vintage in John's time.
So
it tracks, I think, though, for Pyrrha to be the owner of this gun because she's a detective who totally seems the correct and appropriate age to grow up in the nostalgia age for this, like someone who wants to join the force, like, and will grow up watching noir movies with their grandma or something like that.
Totally.
I think, yeah.
So what we're seeing, to me, it's not that Pyrrha is like a military history nerd. It's a bit of like law enforcement history nerd.
Well,
it's criminal history almost.
But also it's got interesting political history. The Thompson was used on both sides of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It was used in the Greek Civil War. It was used in the Korean War. Like, it was used in the Cuban Revolution. Like, there's a lot of interesting uses of it. It also, like, played a role in the Troubles.
So, to me, the thing that is in common, from my understanding of all these various ones, is a lot of them were messy, almost proxy conflicts in which the people using these weapons were not really the people. There was a lot more global influence in these conflicts that this weapon was used in than a direct territorial conflict.
I think in terms of like US involvement in those, for sure, but I think...
Yeah, I guess when I say global influence, what is much more specifically relevant there is US involvement in those conflicts.
I would say that like colonial power structures and the questions of sort of power legitimacy are really relevant to all of those conflicts. Like, who gets to be in charge? And I think that's also true of the use in the mob. Like, the mob arises as a power structure that serves a community.
I'm fond of what we're pulling out of here. The thing that is not clear to me is where do Pyrrha's sympathies lie in terms of holding on to this weapon in their ways of thinking about how this has been related to that, questioning legitimacy of authority.
I think owning a Tommy gun specifically complicates Pyrrha as a cop. I think that raises questions about Pyrrha's kind of loyalty to authority and relationship to the idea of like government legitimacy.
And we talked in some of our, maybe in our first and second episodes, about how one of the big themes that we see in this is imperialism and colonialism and this happening at scale and the individual experiences that people have in terms of navigating their understanding, compliance, and resistance to these structures. So the fact that Pyrrha has an object that very explicitly contextualizes some of the influences on her feelings in that, and looking at, Pyrrha's re-involvement in the story later down the road with Nona, like, oh yeah. Of course there are some really specific things that have formed the way that Pyrrha sees both the larger structures and herself as a player in them.
And also, just to mention, the only other person that we see using a gun in this entire thing is Wake.
Yeah. Is it the same gun?
No, it's a 2-bore gun, which is basically like a shotgun on steroids. So Wake uses a hunting rifle, which has, she uses it specifically as the sleeper in the dream bubble. The teapot and 2 cups that are mentioned are very interesting, because I think that so much of the room implies it was abandoned by Gideon the First alone following the loss of Pyrrha, which would mean that these teacups are either from before Pyrrha died in the lictorial process, or it is foreshadowing to John and his love of conversation over tea with his lictors in Harrow the Ninth.
So the Pentiad and I were chatting about this the other day, that Tamsin Muir seems to use tea as a motif that references an educational video about sex consent that uses making someone a cup of tea as a metaphor for initiating sex. And so if you're not sure whether it's appropriate to initiate sex with someone, you should imagine giving them a cup of tea. Are they asleep? You shouldn't give them a cup of tea, etc. It seems to be that the way that Tamsin Muir is using tea is pointing at consent questions and willingness and resistance in a way that really tracks to that metaphor. And the tension of tea with John and Harrow, and John repeatedly sort of making her feel like she really needs to drink the tea, really tracks with that. And so one thing that this teapot with 2 cups could be doing is telling us about consent.
This sentence ends with the 2 words "abandoned forever." So if we're talking about John, consent, and the way that Harrow and Gideon are perceiving this, they see that the process of sharing tea and engaging in consent is abandoned.
It's over. They were in it voluntarily, and the thems that were are gone now.
That's very good. I really like that, because I also perceived it as being like, if everything else in this room is completely preserved as it was, then that would mean that the tea was completely finished by both parties. And that's what I took from it, is like, they went, well, I guess we're going to have to do this, and finished their tea, and that was that.
They sat down and had a cup of tea before she died.
Oh, I was talking about it as in like John and Gideon were.
Oh.
That's what I meant by, I think that John and Gideon sat down after Pyrrha died and had this conversation in which Gideon and Gideon talked about any sort of hesitations or willingness, and John was like, well, let me assuage you, or whatever, or something like that. And I feel like it could go completely either way. That's the beauty of this chapter, and with all of its foreshadowing, is I could totally see it either way. I think it's like
the thing that the 2 directions though end up with is that, like, the one of them finishing the tea together and then going through the lictorial process is one of like dialogue and patience and consent between each other, and the other one is this power dynamic in which Gideon is full of grief and John realizes he has really all the power because it's already happened. And they're heartbreaking, both, but in very different ways.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's a lot we don't know.
The following sentence immediately ties us to the intimacy between them. It refers to them reaching out and touching hands in the vulnerability of rest. I want to think that means that we're more looking at the first described scenario where they sat and they finished their tea together.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be the like tender, sentimental part of me, but it also is immediately following that. And I want to think that somewhere, occasionally in these books, Tamsin did nice things for us. Just gave us little soft moments.
The beds are different from how they're set up for Harrow and Gideon.
Yes.
These are beds next to each other, not one bed at the foot of the other.
These are set as equals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that this is one of the many really great one-to-one comparisons that I can really, really draw with Tamsin and Homestuck. I don't know how much you guys know about Homestuck relationship quadrants, but it is very obvious to me that I think Tamsin let the idea of platonic soulmates really influence her writing of, in particular, Gideon the First and Pyrrha. And controversial, but it's my opinion, and I'm not trying to convince anybody else of anything. I have no qualms with any shipping. Let me say this for peace. Cam and Pal. Cam and Pal are textbook Homestuck Moirails that are, I don't even think of them as platonic soulmates. I think of them of soulmates on every level of like them being Moirails surpasses. I mean, Moirails really describes like these two couples that I'm talking about of being they're best friends. They're more than best friends. They're more than lovers. They're more than family. They're more than anything anyone could ever understand because they are a part of one another and they could never imagine living another way.
I will also point out that on the dedication, the symbol under PT's name is the Moirail.
Oh, her Moirail marriage.
Let's get into that Lyctor Theorem.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's on a stone that's like attached to the table or something.
I think that mimics the Ten Commandments.
Yikes.
2 great stone tablets.
Okay, yikes.
It's how they were described in the Bible.
Yeah. Oh, I hate that. I hate that very, very much.
That's gross and I love it.
Yeah, John fucking Wood.
And we also get a pivot from, their observation, kind of like trying to take this all in, to now engaging back with each other, trying to process what they're seeing.
And Harrow's getting a little snippy again.
Why do you think she's getting a little snippy?
Yes, Nav, it is an exciting necromancer thing.
She's just impatient. I think she's like, stop talking. I'm writing. I can't write and talk at the same time. Shut up.
But she does also, she's like, just tell me what's important, which is so much trust.
Mm-hmm.
She is genuinely trusting Gideon to like make judgments about the room.
I think it's partially like saying, oh, like it's a little bit of on Harrow's part, like giving a child a task that they cannot mess up because it's just the bedroom area.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
That gives Harrow free reign of the lab, which is the part that she really cares about. But yeah, it does show at least basic trust in being like, I can understand that you know something is important if it glows, has writing, or whatever. Like, there you go. I really wish we knew what theorems actually looked like and not just that they were very dense algorithms in nature, because
one thing to think about is that, like, talking about the way I love comparing mathematics and poetry in terms of using tools to describe things. So if we're looking at like algorithms as the way that we describe what we're seeing in terms of documentation and notation of these theorems, even an algorithm is an incredibly simplified way of trying to create a mnemonic device around something incredibly complex that has many, many dimensions. So one fun experiment that we're not going to do right now, but that might be fun to revisit in a future conversation, is other ways that necromantic theorems could be described, other than using a mathematical metaphor.
That would be really interesting. I will say that the fact that the theorem is the completed methodology for the utilization of a living soul is direct foreshadowing to exactly what Harrow does with Gideon between books in the lobotomy. And so it's like this is the only full theorem that she has written down of the lictoral process. So it is just, I think that's just a point of import of like, yeah, she's brilliant, but this is like, there's a reason why Tamsin Muir had it be these two, like this pairing specifically.
I felt so sad on this reread seeing Harrow's admiration for Gideon, given that when they actually meet, Gideon just repeatedly tries to murder her.
Mm-hmm. The conversations that Harrow and Gideon the First could have had Gideon the First not been like basically taken over mostly by Pyrrha and given the orders by John and everything, like the connection that could have been made there of I saw part of what happened to you would have been so interesting to actually see. But of course, Tamsin couldn't let us have that because it would provide too much context. Love you, Tamsin. Yeah, in hope of attaining lictoral understanding, all glory and love to the Necrolord Prime. So the tablets were put there by Gideon the First and not John.
Unclear, because it's not like it's sort of beneath John to prescribe worship.
Yeah. It could definitely be that he, set these in stone. I think it's like John wasn't worried about his lictors finding out about the full lictoral process. He was worried about them finding out about the last piece that everyone missed except for Anastasia. The biggest thing that might have happened on John's part is the fact that they can't be picked up or moved. Like, you can't take them anywhere. Or, I mean, that could also be on the part of Gideon of, like, no one can, take the evidence of what I've done here away.
Yeah, I really wish we had seen more contrast.
I mean, the only, debris that's mentioned that I think is anything of note is the foreshadowing of Pyrrha being a cig smoker, and then the flimsy, obviously.
Yeah, this is our first exposure to One Flesh, One End.
Yeah, One Flesh, One End, G&P.
So in the way that I love looking at the structural tendencies of Muir's writing, we can go from postscript to like that great phrase, one flesh, one end. And then we're talking about the people who were in this. We're talking about the picture, Gideon closely examining this picture of everyone posed together. And then it pivots into these much less observational, but more reflective and emotional notes of, we go from those who were lost during the initial research, and then we start talking about Magnus and Abigail. So we go from, they're observing this room, they're noting the information present here, and now we're getting into the human experience.
Gideon is observing these two people who are so close and so entangled. And then she is like remembering Magnus and Abigail and just getting hit with this huge loneliness.
Which, Harrow is like kind of baffled by.
But she takes it. She's like, all right, like I see that this isn't good.
And in terms of like foreshadowing, their feelings in this room upon reflecting on these pieces that are affecting them right now, Gideon and Pyrrha's relationship, the ways in which things have been left here, and their feelings of their own experience here in Canaan House, they don't have the larger picture to really note that this grief and this unsettling kind of confusion kind of belongs in this room.
Yeah, like the weird feeling that you get when you enter like a mortuary home where you're like, oh God, everyone who's like stepped foot in here has been experiencing some sort of grief and loss, and like just like everything about this room points towards Abacus.
Abacus!
Abigail. We've found a new ship name, everyone. Abigail and Magnus's like closeness and their proximity, I think. Yeah, it's yeah,
and then
Harrow's
Harrow is says, you know, I can no longer accept being a stranger to you. Like the intimacy that is set up by their observation of this room, by their acknowledgement of the relationship of the people in this room, by their acknowledgement of their grief in relationship to Abigus, is immediately channeled into their reflection of their own relationship.
And at the same time, Gideon is hit with that sort of additional layer of the rope tying her to Harrow and back to the bars of the House of the Ninth. Like, she is not in this moment of challenging Harrow as Harrow's equal. They are still bound by the power dynamic of their relationship and by the fact that the Ninth owns her.
Gideon is not actually free to reckon with her relationship to power that developed as an indentured servant. Gideon is never free in these books. So she never has a chance to reckon with those relationships to power that Harrow in these very moments is in her own way doing.
And in her pursuit of, I think that Gideon suffers from a thing that a lot of like Greek tragic figures suffer from. Like Gideon behaves as if she's the freest person in the room, as if she's as free as a bird, because she knows that she's not. And in her saying, I'm not anybody's son or daughter, it absolves her of being beholden to anyone. But by the time that we get to Nona, her resolve has been so broken down that it's all that she has left to become a daughter of the houses and a daughter of the first, you know?
Yeah. Instead of truly being removed from it, she becomes almost as deeply enmeshed with it as you could possibly be.
Yeah, she this is why Gideon and Harrow are such good foils, is because, I mean, Harrow is the one that starts off with all of this like fealty that isn't even really to the houses or to God, it's just to what's in the locked tomb. And then it turns around to Gideon later on in the books being kind of fake into this tower prince act.
They're both deeply disobedient to the Ninth, and then they're both deeply disobedient to the first, but in both cases in really different ways.
Yeah, and because she knew that I think she was never actually beholden to the Ninth, it was really just to Harrow that she even admits later on in the book of like, you know, I never really gave a damn about the locked tomb, I just cared about you. Gideon and Harrow already do trust one another, they just don't want to admit it. They're like that's how they do the whole like basic like the anime fighting back to back sequence, because they know every single hit that each other has thrown because it's been at each other. It's been aimed at one another since they were children. Like,
but I think one of the things here is that the ways in which that trust can be expressed, they're still learning. They're like, what is a language that is meaningful right now?
I think the place that they don't have the trust, they have a high degree of being able to predict one another, but Gideon is very aware that she cannot rely on Harrow to promote her interests.
Yeah. I think, that's like why to me I was kind of surprised that Harrow bargained with sleep and not with like, you can go and do what you're good at and prove more of what you're good at to your peers, which is like partially what you want to do anyways.
Gideon set the terms, right?
Yes, Gideon set the terms, but Harrow agreed to them and said 8.5 and we start right away. And didn't modify them at all. She
did modify them. She didn't promise to drop the topic.
Oh, Harrow. It's so funny. Yeah. Oh, the part in which Harrow is compared to Jean-Marie, I think, is like it's so hard hitting now looking back at a character who is 17 and no longer being 17, like that feeling of, I do now understand as someone who, like, I work in a school, I do understand looking at 17-year-olds and being like, oh my God, you're so young. You're painfully young to look at. And I remember being 17 and like reading that line and, you know, like I wasn't like, I'm not a baby. Like, you know, I think it really shows a lot of like Harrow's true nature of like just desperation and like how that there is an immature aspect to that, despite the maturity of Harrow's entire persona that she kind of puts on as a front.
Yeah, Gideon is a little bit aware of how young they are, but it's like she's not quite aware of herself being young. She's aware of Harrow being young. And that 1 year does like makes a difference to her, but it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah. They're both so painfully young in this.
Yeah.
And
that awareness of youngness is carried on in the end of this section, where suddenly we've had a drastic pivot in the way that Gideon perceives the teens. The language that she chooses to use to describe them is day and night from every other way that she's described them previously in the book. So her language has drastically changed, but not like in an extension to what you've said about like Gideon can see Harrow's youngness, but that doesn't extend to her own awareness of herself and a compassion to her own experience. Isaac and Jean-Marie, poor little buggers, but like Harrow and Gideon are two kids in this too. And she sees Harrow's desperation, recognizes Harrow's desperation. Gideon isn't a poor little bugger.
But she has moved out of that like contempt for them and that kind of disgust and anxiety towards them and towards just a kindness, which I think maybe she's moved a little bit better on herself as well.
She's asking for something that she really wants and needs in terms of her sleep. Yeah. And she's not, quibbling with the ways in which Harrow is saying, okay, this is what it's going to look like. She's like, okay, I need this. And we're going to get it, and we're going to keep moving forward.
Yeah, she's not asking for stupid bullshit like sunglasses. She's asking for sleep that she actually really needs.
Yeah. But we know the sad and trying reality is that this will remain incomplete to the last. He can't fix my deficiencies here. Please give Gideon my congratulations, however.
So, obviously these are lines of a note that has been burned at both edges and are cutting off the starting and the ending of each line. I've always wondered how much of the note has actually been cut off, because it's obviously not so much that we're missing a lot of context.
And in the audiobook, it doesn't cut off the sounds that would be a very literal reading out loud of this. Moira Quirk uses the full words that one would assume out of what we are given, which doesn't necessarily negate what you're saying, but is an interesting additional piece of information, which is why I didn't say "ut" rather than "but." The choice to include the full words was what was made for the audiobook.
That's fascinating. I've never listened to the audiobooks. Obviously, this note being from Anastasia, it's always been obvious that it was Anastasia to me. I don't know if anyone agrees with that.
Oh, why? Why is it Anastasia?
It could either be Anastasia or Cytherea. I understand the implication of it being Cytherea. My way of interpreting it, like line by line, when I was like a baby reading this, I think from my binder, I remember writing the sad and trying realities of the journey towards lictorial understanding. Like, this will remain incomplete. If that line did not exist, this would be a Cytherea shoo-in. This will remain incomplete was put in there for a reason, though. And the only thing that is incomplete at this time in which this letter would have been left, 10,000, or I guess at that point it had been like what, 3,000-4,000 years when they left Canaan House? I don't remember. When they left Canaan House, the incomplete aspect of the lictors was Anastasia. He can't fix my deficiencies that were caused by my misapprehension of the process with Samael.
Yeah. I assumed Cytherea because deficiencies is such a big eugenics trigger word. And the next house skull, like immediately we go from this note to a 7th house skull. And so I was like, oh, for sure. But I think that's a misdirect. I think you're right.
From what I remember about the John chapters, I remember about something in either Harrow or Nona about them saying when the lictor trials happened was that they had the full cast of people already there. They had all of the lictors already there when they realized that they had to become lictors. They had all, 14 of them present at Canaan House.
Oh.
And that was always my understanding. And I don't know if it's just been too long since I've read these books, but from what I remember, I thought they were like, oh, well, he was keeping all of us immortal. And it was taking too much of a toll on him to constantly be doing this upkeep, which is why we started trying to look for the lictorial process.
So it wasn't really 2 generations exactly.
It was 2 generations of Augustine and Alfred, Mercy Morn and Christabel, Gideon and Pyrrha, and then Ulysses and Titania, and Cassiopeia and Nigella were all in one gen because they were pre-resurrection.
Okay.
But everyone following them joined their group essentially because they were expanding the house system, I think. Because it's mentioned, third house people, Cyrus and
Valency.
Yes, Cyrus and Valancy they started the third house, but they were not from the third house. They could not have been from the third house. I really don't think that this is about Cytherea. This will remain incomplete. Just doesn't seem like, what about Cytherea is incomplete?
So I think the biggest hint of what incomplete is referring to is congratulations. But again, could be a misdirect. So if we're talking specifically about lictorhood process, that makes sense for them to be referring to the same thing. Given what you just described, though, the expansion of the house systems is also a relevant thing being added to their larger world right now.
Mm-hmm.
But that is completed at this point because this second generation has come onto the scene, and I'm assuming as they are identified as the heads of these houses, the originators of these houses, these larger sets. I don't know. I'm just pulling up a contrasting idea that could be there, but at the end of the day, the deficiencies and the congratulations, those are the contrasting pieces within this note.
Mm-hmm. Was she the first gen or the second? This is talking about Cytherea. And John says, early second, we were still experimenting with getting the 6th installation up and running. Some of the houses were empty. And Mercy Morn says, no, we had it running by then because Valancy was with us and Anastasia. And they said, yes, you were right. We were all there to meet her. All 16 of us.
Oh.
All 16 of them were there to meet Cytherea, which means that there were at least, Cytherea was the last one. So that's at least John, Augustine, Alfred, Mercy Morn, Christabel, Gideon, Pyrrha, Cassiopeia, Nigella, Cyrus, Valancy, Ulysses, Titania, Anastasia, Samael, and Alecto. And all 16 of us were there to meet her. Those would be the 16 people. And Cytherea would have been the 17th. That's where I remember it being, all of them had been there, which meant the lictorial trials had not started by the time that Cytherea joined them, which meant that the gens only refer to when they all got to Canaan House and not to when they became lictors.
Yeah, that totally shifts how I'd been thinking about that. Because you're right, that's totally unambiguous. I had kind of thought that there were 2 sort of waves of becoming lictors, which didn't really make sense, honestly.
Yeah, because what discoveries would there be? And it would make the 9 trials that have the 8 trial rooms at Canaan House. Why would there be so many? And why would each of the lictor pairs have a single one?
And why not then recruit a handful of people at a time? Yeah. Yeah, it didn't fit, but I couldn't, that fixes that for me. You have solved the puzzle. Go. Kit, it was so lovely to have you join us and talk about this rich chapter with so many weird little clues in it. Where can people find you if they want to connect with more of your stuff and ideas and awesome cosplays?
You can find me on TikTok and Instagram as Venus Vultures. You can also find me on Tumblr and Twitter at Of the Sewn Tongue. Thank you guys so much for letting me gab at you. This was truly an honor. I haven't really gotten to dig my my fingies into the text like this in so long. So thank you guys.
It was a pleasure, and you're welcome to come back anytime.
Yay!
Nunpod with Left Grief is created by Claire Beans and Han Cayley and edited by Han Cayley. Our music is Only Human by Philip Ayres. Today's cover art features our guest, Kit, as Harrow Hark. Visit us at nunpod.com. That's NUNPOD.com. Thanks for listening.